Thank you. That was a really long introduction. If I had known you're going to read all of this, I would have written it shorter. So the title of this talk is NC Max, Breaking the Throughput Limit of Nakamoto Consensus. So when you see this title, I think many people would have the same concern that, oh, come on, it's another consensus protocol. There are so many of them. It's impossible to remember all of them. And somebody told me that I've listened to hundreds of talks about consensus protocols, and it's still very difficult for me to evaluate them. I cannot tell the truth from the lies. So my answer is, in this talk, I will show you some simple evaluation criteria. The second concern is they are just getting more and more complicated as the field progresses. Well, the good news is I agree. I think complexity is the enemy of security. Thus, NC Max is based on Nakamoto consensus. Let's go back from the very beginning. The third concern is NC's old school. It's too old. My answer is old school is the best school. I think hopefully I can persuade you that why NC is still a very good base for future endeavors. Let's get started. Here's the outline of this presentation. I will start from Nakamoto consensus, why we love it, because it's simple and flexible, and then come to NC's limitations. Namely, it's low throughput, and it is vulnerable to selfish mining attack. And we're going to introduce NC Max. First, it's two-step transaction confirmation mechanism. We decouple transaction synchronization from confirmation. Then it's dynamic DAM. DAM means difficulty adjustment mechanism to fully exploit the node's bandwidth. And we analyze NC Max's security and show you how NC Max inherits NC's security and selfish mining is no longer profitable. And last, we evaluate the performance of NC Max. To conclude, we want to persuade you this message that the network layer is equally important as the consensus layer. All right, let's move on. Nakamoto consensus. Let's first revisit NC's goals and challenges. Recall that a consensus protocol maintains a ledger that everyone agrees, append-only and ever-growing. But Nakamoto consensus is not just any consensus protocol. It's the child of the cypherpunk movement. Here is the famous magazine issue that kickstarts the cypherpunk movement. So it's a permissionless consensus protocol. It means that it must be open. Nodes can dynamically join and leave the system. Decentralized, there's no trusted party, and pseudonymous, there is no identity. How does it work? In NC, the ledger is organized as a chain of blocks. Each contains a set of transactions, and everyone stores a copy. Who is everyone? Meet everyone. Everyone is these 10,000 volunteer nodes scattered around the globe. To extend the ledger, the blocks are generated by miners. Miners are a special kind of participants who are willing to contribute their computational power to strengthen the security of the system. In each round, a miner broadcasts its block, and miners who accept the block will include its hash in the next block they create. Here comes a question: how to choose that miner, and how to choose among conflicting histories. Before we go into the protocol, here's another primitive. Proof of work. It's a computational task or puzzle that is challenge specific. Means there's a different puzzle for every challenge, and each solution is only valid for one puzzle. It's impossible to reuse a proof of work puzzle. And it's easy to generate and verify. It's moderately hard to solve. Hashcash is the simplest proof of work puzzle. The puzzle goes as follows. To find X such that the hash result of the challenge concatenated with X is smaller than a predefined threshold. Recall that in a hash function, A hash function is easy to compute, but difficult to reverse. It's infeasible to compute x from the hash result. So the only way to solve the puzzle is to enumerate x values. So how to choose that miner? Every miner in Nakamoto consensus works on finding the solution nonce to the following hash-cache puzzle. The hash result of the transactions concatenated with the previous block and the nonce is smaller than a predefined target. The target is dynamically adjusted via a difficulty adjustment mechanism, so that on average a block is found every 10 minutes. It is necessary to have a dam because as the network computing power increase or decrease, we need to adjust the difficulty so that blocks are produced at roughly the same rate. Whoever finds the solution first broadcasts the block. The probability that a miner is selected is proportional to its computing power. Now we know how to choose that miner. But there's a remaining question, how to choose among conflicting histories. In a fork, namely when multiple chains are mined with the same previous block, the protocol prescribes that miners choose the chain that is most computationally challenging to produce, which is usually referred to as the longest chain. 2 blocks with the target 10 is equivalent to 1 block with the target 5. Or in a tie, the first received block. So now we know how to choose among conflicting histories. Here comes another question. Why would people want to be that miner? To encourage mining, a coin-based transaction in a block issues a fixed amount of mining reward, which is new bitcoins to the miner, currently 6.25 bitcoins. And each transaction submits a small transaction fee to the miner. You can think of the transaction fee as a tip. The reward halves every 4 years. So now all the questions are answered. We know why people want to be that miner. There's a financial incentive attached to it. But what happened when conflicting blocks are mined at the same time? One of them will be orphaned. When a fork happens, some blocks will eventually be abandoned. We call these blocks orphan blocks. Blocks do not end up in the main chain. They have no block reward. They can be either natural orphans, namely honest blocks mined during other blocks' propagation, or caused by attacks, for example, selfish mining. The naturally orphaned block frequency is not very good before July 2017. It's roughly once per day. But at July, what happens? Thanks to the user-activated soft fork movement, everyone updates their clients to support compact block. So from then on, there's almost never an orphan blocks. Before July, there were only 6 orphan blocks in 2018 and 4 in 2019, thanks to the compact block mechanism. We will come back to this magical algorithm later. This is one of the orphan blocks in 2019. So why we love Nakamoto consensus? Here are 3 reasons. First, NC relies on a minimum set of assumptions. Consequently, its security is carefully scrutinized and well understood. Here is just a subset of papers that analyze NC's security. Why is minimum set of security assumptions a good thing? Because when you think about assumptions, you should translate it in your head to vulnerabilities. The more assumptions a protocol has, the more vulnerabilities it opens when these assumptions are not met. So minimize the security assumptions also reduces the vulnerabilities. The second reason why we love Nakamoto consensus is that NC minimizes the consensus protocol's communication overhead. For example, in Bitcoin, each block's propagation requires only one message and it's done. It's much simpler than any classic consensus protocols and simpler than any proof of stake consensus protocols, definitely. And propagating a 1 megabyte block is equivalent to propagating a compact block of around 13 kilobytes. Why is that? Because a compact block contains only the truncated transaction IDs of the transactions. It's like a sketch of all the transactions in the block. So if the receiver of a compact block realizes that I can reconstruct all the transactions in my memory, then there's no need to transfer these transactions a second time. So as long as all the transactions in the block are already synchronized, there's no need to transfer anything else other than the compact block. It does not go better than that. This is the best thing you could achieve. A node's bandwidth, you can think of it as 3 parts. The first is we used for transaction synchronization. This is unnecessary for all layer 1 protocols. The second part is the consensus protocol's consumption. NC minimize this part. The third part is idle, which is apparent. The third reason why we love Nakamoto consensus is that because thanks to its chain-based structure, there's a natural transaction order. Earlier transactions in earlier blocks are considered prior to transactions in later blocks. And inside a block, transactions are ordered according to their order in the block. The benefit of this is that transactions are ordered at block generation, so that both transaction validity and transaction execution results are straightforward. I want to remind you that transaction validity and transaction execution results are 2 different things. For example, consider the following 2 smart contract function calls. The first transaction is x equals x minus 2. The second transaction is x equals x times 5. Both transactions are valid, but if the order is changed, the result is changed. So transaction validity is different from transaction execution results. What about the new protocols? I thought many of them claim that they are comprehensively better than Nakamoto consensus. Is that so? Okay, we categorize these protocols into 3 types. The first type, we call it NC's chain-based variants. There are many protocols in this type, according to the aforementioned fruit chain protocol. Our study shows that none of them outperforms Nakamoto consensus against all attacker incentives. And we discovered a dilemma. We call it rewarding the bad versus punishing the good. These chain-based variants, they usually try to address the attacks via a novel reward distribution mechanism. But modifying the reward distribution mechanism has a price. For example, if you reward all the blocks, regardless of whether they are orphan blocks or not, then there's no risk to double spend. The attacker can try to double spend something continuously, and the attacker will not be punished because all the blocks are rewarded eventually. If you punish some blocks, then you actually introduced another tool for the attacker to perform censorship attack. The attacker can threaten that if you don't obey my order, if you don't censor these transactions, I will try to fork the blockchain so that you and I are both going to be punished. The third group, we call it reward lucky protocols. The problem with this group of protocol is that lucky blocks doesn't mean they are good blocks. The attacker can utilize the lucky blocks to claim the rewards and utilize the unlucky blocks to perform the attack because they don't receive any reward anyway. So why not using them to try to perform the attack? The second group of protocols, we call them DAG protocols. The idea is to abandon the chain and to use a direct acyclic graph ledger structure. Simultaneous blocks is not always a good thing because there's no natural transaction order in these blocks. It's difficult to determine which block comes first and which block comes after because each miner may have different views on the receiving order. Consequently, you can either settle the transaction order after the blockchain topology is fixed, which means there needs to be a very long transaction confirmation delay. You need to wait until the blockchain topology is stable around the neighborhood before you can start to execute these transactions. Or there's another choice that you can leave the transaction order undecided forever, which results in limited smart contract functionalities. Recall the previous example where I tried to persuade you that the transaction validity is not the same as transaction execution results. Well, in these protocols, the transaction is the smart contract is halted forever. Nobody can do anything anymore. And this is not the end of it. DAG protocols also have duplicate transaction packing problem because blocks are generated at roughly the same time. Very likely, these blocks will contain the same set of transactions, which is a problem. It definitely increases the computational overhead of nodes, and it can increase either the latency to synchronize these blocks or the bandwidth. If you use some mechanism to ensure that no transaction is transferred twice, then you need to have several rounds of communication to negotiate what do I have and what do you have. If you don't care about that, you just simply forward the entire block, then it's a huge waste of bandwidth. And there are some difficulties in distributing transaction fees because each transaction is incorporated multiple times in simultaneous blocks. It is difficult to decide on how to issue the transaction fees. In fact, several designs does not address this problem. They just don't mention the word fee in their entire paper. I have many quotes in this protocol's vulnerabilities, but due to time constraints, I think the arguments are already pretty clear. Third type of protocol, we call them proof of possession protocols, namely proof of stake and proof of space protocols. These protocols select nodes to compose blocks based on their possession of some scarce resources. The problem is the resources are not consumed as in proof of work protocols, which means extra protection or assumptions to prevent attackers from generating conflicting histories is necessary. Because generating conflicting history is free, you have to do something to prevent this kind of behavior. A designer has two choices. You can either create more complicated protocols, which means these protocols will have higher bandwidth consumption. Recall that a node's bandwidth has three parts. If you increase the consensus protocol's bandwidth consumption, it means that you're decreasing the bandwidth that could have been used to synchronize transactions. You're harming the protocol's throughput. The other choice is that you introduce new security assumptions. Security assumptions are security vulnerabilities. So you actually introduce more attack vectors when these assumptions are not met. To sum up, why we start from Nakamoto consensus? We choose it for its security, because its security is well understood. We like it for its simplicity. It has the lowest communication overhead among all the consensus protocols. And for its flexibility, it supports arbitrary smart contract models. Later protocols have their merits, but NC is still a best space for further innovation. Old school is the best school. Do you know who she is? This is the greatest female Go player in the game's history. She's 55 years old and she's still a top player in the field. Okay, let's talk about NC's limitations. I think the logo pretty much says it all. The throughput is low. In WeChat processes around 12,000 transactions per second on average. And the peak throughput for Alipay is 256,000 transactions per second. Comparing to this centralized payment platform, the transaction processing capacity of Bitcoin and Ethereum are extremely low. Ethereum implements a variant of NC. So the first thing we don't like about Nakamoto consensus is that it has a manual throughput limit. The block size and block interval do not change along with the network condition. In this paper, the researchers discovered that the Bitcoin IPv4 nodes, which used to be connected to the network with a median bandwidth of 33 Mbps in 2016, have a median bandwidth of 56 Mbps as of February 2017. So the network condition keeps improving, but the Bitcoin network is not improving accordingly. Here's a bad attempt to utilize this additional throughput. It's called Bitcoin Unlimited. Researchers have identified that this protocol is vulnerable to several attacks. By the way, that researcher is me. We will come back to why this is bad later. The second thing we don't like about Nakamoto consensus is that it's vulnerable to selfish mining attack. In this figure, the blue double line indicates the public network, and the blue square indicates the time a block is published to the network. When the attacker finds a block, instead of publishing it to the network, the attacker withholds it and hope to secretly mine on top of this block to gain further advantage in the mining game. When the honest miner finds a block, the attacker will broadcast the block, hoping that the next miner will mine after the attacker block. If the attacker is lucky enough to find 2 blocks in a row, when the honest miner finds a block, the attacker will publish all the blocks so that the honest block will be orphaned and the attacker's block rewards are guaranteed. The third thing we don't like about Nakamoto consensus is that it has an inherent throughput limit. On the one hand, as the block interval follows exponential distribution, most of the bandwidth is idle. For Nakamoto consensus, although the consensus protocol itself bandwidth consumption is minimized, a lot of bandwidth is in idle, just like in this figure. There's a long pause between 2 continuous blocks in most cases. On the other hand, if you want to raise the block size or lower the block interval, it will raise the orphan rate. Why is that? In this figure, the block size is raised. So each block takes longer to propagate. The curve to synchronize the transactions inside the block is longer than the previous figure. As a result, it's more likely that another block will be found before the previous block has finished synchronization, thus lead to more orphan blocks. If you reduce the block interval, more blocks will be found within the same interval, which means it's also more likely that some blocks will be found before the other blocks have finished propagation. So in both cases, the number of orphan blocks increases and the security lowers, the throughput lowers. Why are orphan blocks bad for security and throughput? As is shown in this figure, when there are too many orphans, it's actually easier for the attacker to secretly generate a longer chain. The attacker no longer needs 50% of computing power. Perhaps 40% or 30% is already enough because all these minus blocks invalidate each other. Also, these orphan blocks do not contribute to transaction confirmation. So the bandwidth used to synchronize these orphan blocks are actually wasted. Let's dive into NC Max. First, we introduce this two-step transaction confirmation mechanism. We want to increase the security and the throughput. To do that, we need to lower the orphan rate. How do we lower the orphan rate? We lower the orphan rate by reducing the block propagation delay. But how to reduce the block propagation delay? What is the bottleneck of current block propagation delay? It's the fresh transactions in the block. What are fresh transactions? These are newly broadcast transactions that have not finished propagating to the network when they are embedded in blocks. In this example, so in this figure, let's go back to the previous slide. In this figure, the red one is the fresh transaction. In this example, when there's no fresh transaction, when node B receives the compact block, it can forward the compact block directly to its downstream peers. So the interval, one-step interval is around 0.1 second. However, when there are fresh transactions, node B needs to first get the fresh transactions from the upstream peers and then receive the results reply to this query. Only then can node B forwards the compact block to its downstream peers. See, without fresh transaction, 0.1 second. With fresh transaction, 0.5 to 2 seconds. The first thing we do is to confirm the bottleneck. Is that true, that fresh transaction is the current block propagation bottleneck? First, we verify the relation between the number of fresh transactions and the block propagation latency. We deployed modified Bitcoin clients to reject some transactions and record the one-hop latency. The results show that when there's no fresh transaction, the one-hop block propagation latency is 0.1 second. With fresh transaction is 0.5 to 2 seconds. These are our experimental results on the Bitcoin network. Second, we verify when you decrease the block interval, the percentage of fresh transaction increases. We simulated the Bitcoin network with a lower block interval. The results show that when the block interval is 2 minutes, namely 120 seconds, there's no fresh transaction in the blocks. But when you decrease the block interval, there are more and more fresh transactions in the blocks. When the block interval is decreased to 3 seconds, the blocks are full of fresh transactions. Third, previous work showed that when the block size increases, the block propagation latency also increases. So here comes the two-step transaction confirmation mechanism in NC Max. A transaction is first proposed in the transaction proposal zone with its truncated IDs. Here is the transaction proposal zone. It's around 15 kilobytes in nervous CKB. It's very small. Then the transactions are committed with its full content after wclose to wfar blocks. Wclose and wfar are two system parameters. So it is first proposed. Only after a fixed number of blocks can it be committed. And the proposed transaction can be malformed, illegal, or even missing, but that doesn't matter because later miners can skip them, can skip these malformed, illegal, and missing transactions when they confirm the remaining transactions. The last part in the block structure are uncle block headers with their proposal zones. We will see why that is useful later. So the block propagation procedure in NC Max is as follows. When a node B receives a compact block, it can directly forward the compact block to its downstream peers. Only afterwards, can node B query the newly proposed transactions from its upstream peers and get the replies. So the step of querying for the newly proposed transactions and get the reply is removed from the critical path of block propagation. Therefore, blocks can always be propagated at the fastest rate. Here's the bandwidth utilization of NCMax. By decoupling transaction synchronization and confirmation, we allow parallel transaction processing, similar to DAG protocols, while preserving the chain-based structure. By then recoupling the two steps, in an updated block structure, we inherit NC's security properties and simplicity in reward distribution. So in NCMax, there are no idle moments. And it doesn't matter whether the next block is found before the previous block has finished its transaction synchronization, because these are unrelated. These two procedures are decoupled. So next, we introduced the difficulty adjustment mechanism. Our DAM has two goals. First is to render selfish mining unprofitable. Second is to dynamically adjust the bandwidth based on the network's condition. It's not trivial because we also need to satisfy more constraints. First, we want a fixed target epoch duration. Second, we want a fixed maximum reward per epoch, unlike Ethereum. Ethereum is heavily criticized for the total amount of Ether is unpredictable because of uncle rewards. Third, we want to fix the maximum change rate on the hash rate estimation in line with Bitcoin. Fourth, we want to fix the upper and lower bounds on the expected block interval to ensure security. To address selfish mining, the idea is to incorporate all the blocks rather than just the main chain in the hash rate estimation. Why does that work? To understand that, we need to go one step further to examine why is selfish mining profitable. Without selfish mining, in this figure, the attacker gets 3 blocks and the honest miners get 7 blocks. With selfish mining, 7 honest blocks are orphaned. So the attacker gets 3 blocks and the honest miners get 4 blocks. So the time duration is the same, but without the selfish mining, there are 10 blocks. With the selfish mining, there are only 7 main chain blocks. The main chain grows slower. Consequently, the difficulty lowers in the next epoch. Therefore, more rewards with the same mining power for the attacker. Because the attacker is mining at a lower difficulty, thanks to the selfish mining in the first epoch. That's why selfish mining is profitable. It's not profitable in the first epoch, it's only profitable after the first epoch. So if we incorporate all the blocks in the difficulty adjustment, the difficulty remains the same regardless of whether the attacker performs selfish mining or not. Consequently, the attacker cannot get more reward in the second epoch with the same mining power. Wait a minute. What if the attacker turns off the mining equipment to lower the difficulty? I don't try to lower the difficulty via selfish mining. I just turn off my own mining gear so that the main chain grows slower. That doesn't matter. If you want to know why, you can check out our proof in the paper. We will release the paper as soon as it's accepted. To fully exploit the bandwidth, we want to dynamically adjust the block interval based on the network's condition. How to do that? We adjust the expected block interval based on the orphan rate. It's a very complicated procedure, but we have some elegant results when no edge cases are triggered. The next epoch's target equals the previous epoch's target times the ideal orphan rate divided by the actual orphan rate. The actual equation is very simple, but the deduction is very complicated. Check the paper for the deduction. The results are quite satisfiable. The network hash rate of Nervous CKB, which implements NC Max, has grown 150 times in the first 6 months. But the orphan rate stabilizes at 2.5%, which is our target. These encouraging results demonstrate the effectiveness of our difficulty adjustment. The orphan rate goes over 3% for only 2 days. During these 2 days, the hash rate increases significantly. This is not our fault. Here are more numbers of Nervous CKB. The long-term average block interval is 7.5 seconds, and the long-term average orphan rate is 2.5%. In comparison, in Ethereum, the long-term average block interval is 14 seconds, and the long-term average orphan rate is 10%. NCMax successfully reduced the orphan rate because our blocks propagate a lot faster. The epoch duration is close to the 4-hour target, as can be seen in this figure. Most epochs are between 220 minutes and 260 minutes. And the planned block interval matches well with the actual block interval. I mean, we want the block interval to be 20 seconds, then it is 20 seconds, meaning that our estimation on the network hash rate is accurate. Only by doing that can we successfully control the orphan rate, can we stabilize the orphan rate. Security analysis. To understand NCMax security, let's first recall how NC proof its security. All the proofs in the literature are on NC's backbone protocol. To summarize NC's backbone protocol, it follows the longest chain rule and the first receive rule. And it relies on 3 assumptions. First, the block interval is significantly larger than the block propagation latency. Second, a valid block to the miner is valid to the others. Third, there's enough entropy in the block, which is trivial to satisfy given that the miner signature is in there. Let's come back to Bitcoin Unlimited. What's wrong with it? In BU, valid blocks to some are not valid to the others, so it violates the second assumption. The BU is not an instance of Bitcoin backbone protocol, which is why our paper is called On the Necessity of a Prescribed Block Validity Consensus. If you violate one assumption, you have to take the consequences. So let's check NCMax. Longest chain and first receive rule, yes. Block interval significantly larger than block propagation latency. It's actually better in NCMax because block propagation latency is significantly reduced in NCMax. Moreover, our fourth constraint, namely there's an upper bound and a lower bound on the block interval, ensures this relation. A valid block to the miner is valid to the others, yes. There's enough entropy in the block, yes. Consequently, NCMax inherits NC's security properties. All the security proofs are applicable to NCMax. Next, performance evaluation. Let me first show you some interesting numbers. This protocol claims that they can achieve, what's the number? 10,000 transactions per second with 1 million nodes. I'm really curious, like where are you going to find this 1 million nodes? And this protocol claims that it can achieve a throughput of 710,000 transactions per second. Bravo. This protocol claims that they can achieve 10 to the power of 12 transactions per second and a confirmation time of under 1 second. The universe is really not big enough for your protocol. nobody believes those protocols. Here is the actual physical limits of permissionless layer 1 consensus. For throughput, if you assume the nodes bandwidth are 10 Mbps, 10 megabits per second, then the throughput cannot exceed 2,500 TPS. And the maximum speed from ordinary computer to verify ECDSA signature is 4,000 transactions per second. You cannot go beyond that. Otherwise, some computers are not fast enough. Here are some facts. In Bitcoin, a 2 input to output transaction is roughly 450 bytes. So it's unfair to assume smaller transaction size because most transactions are of this size. And with 20 megabits per second bandwidth, it's possible to achieve maximum throughput of 5,000, but it requires the signature algorithm to support signature aggregation. Have your protocol actually considered that before you claim higher throughput? And the transaction confirmation latency is as follows. When the bandwidth is exhausted, it actually takes 30 to 60 seconds to confirm a transaction. And when the bandwidth is idle, it takes 15 to 20 seconds to confirm a transaction. This is the physical limit. You cannot be faster than that. Why? Because when the bandwidth is exhausted, transaction propagation takes longer, 20 to 50 seconds. Because nodes bandwidths are always fully occupied by transaction synchronization, new transactions have to wait. They have to wait until previous transactions have finished synchronization before they can be synchronized. So this is the natural latency of transaction synchronization. And before a transaction is synchronized, it is impossible to claim that it is confirmed. And each transaction takes at least 2 rounds of messages to confirm. After the transaction is synchronized, the first message is to incorporate, is to embed the transaction. Because one block can never be considered a fixed, a settled thing. There is never a protocol where one message is considered settled, because the sender of the message can always be corrupted right before he sends the message. So it takes at least 2 rounds of messages to confirm a transaction. Hence, the transaction confirmation latency. Our evaluation environment is close to the Bitcoin network. It uses 10 megabits per second uniform bandwidth. 6,000 nodes, each has 8 random outgoing connections. Latencies are sampled from Bitcoin. There are 20 miners whose mining power distribution are also sampled from Bitcoin. We use 3 transaction packing workloads, 100, 1,000, and 2,500. And the expected block interval, we use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20, and 40. Here comes the results. In Nakamoto consensus, even if the throughput is 100, it takes roughly 4 seconds for the block to be propagated to the network. If the throughput is 1,000 TPS, it takes 17.5 seconds for the transaction to be synchronized, for the block to be synchronized. And when the throughput is 2,500, it takes around 30 to 40 seconds to synchronize a block. But in NC Max, the block propagation latency is independent of the block interval and independent of the block size. It's always fixed. It takes 300 to 500 milliseconds to propagate to 50% of nodes, and around 600 milliseconds to propagate to 90% of the nodes. The orphan rate is also constant. It's independent of the block size. In NC, as the throughput increases, the orphan rate also increases. In NC Max, these things are irrelevant. the orphan rate is always the lowest. With the same orphan rate, the block interval in NC max is 1/5 that of NC. Last, the minimum proposed commit distance. The minimum proposed commit distance is measured as blocks. It is used to ensure that transactions have finished propagation when committed. The normal life cycle of a transaction is that it is first proposed, and then we wait for like 2 blocks for transaction to synchronize, and then we commit it. The distance must be at least 2 to resist transaction withholding attacks better than Nakamoto consensus. Here are the results. So with 100 TPS, the minimum distance 2 is adequate for all the settings. But as the throughput increases, it requires more blocks before the transaction's proposal and commitment, which is natural because when the throughput is almost exhausted, transaction propagation takes longer. We have to wait for this transaction to be synchronized. Ensuring this latency is not only necessary for the security of NC max, but also necessary for all layer 1 consensus protocol. So it's not a disadvantage. Comparison with DEX. Here are the competitors. Prism. In Prism, they split the transactions into queues according to their colors. A transaction's color is deterministically computed based on the transaction's ID. And each transaction block possesses 1 color. In the second setting, we call it other DAG lower bound. This setting packs transactions from the oldest transactions. The third setting is called other DAG upper bound. They pack randomly. To ensure a fair comparison, all of them use 2,500 TPS workload. And we use the same sequence of mining events, the same memory pool size of 300 megabytes. The results are as follows. NC max always achieves the full throughput of 2,500 transactions per second. Other DAG upper bound is close to our protocol, but this is just a theoretical example. In reality, miners don't pack random transactions. They pack from the highest fee per byte transactions, so they can never achieve this upper bound. Other DAG lower bound performs almost identical with Nakamoto consensus. Why is that? Because before receiving the main chain block, the orphan blocks does not know there is a main chain blocks, so they pack the same set of transactions. So orphan blocks do not contribute to transaction confirmation if all of them pack from the oldest transactions. In Prism, Prism confirms more transactions with the increasing number of colors, but that comes with a price. The more colors, the longer transaction confirmation latency. And Prism 6 colors has already a lot larger transaction confirmation latency than NC max. To conclude, what we did, we chose NC as a base for further innovation for its security, simplicity, and flexibility. To reduce the number of orphans, we introduced 2-step transaction confirmation. The same backbone protocol to inherit security, the chain-based structure to preserve flexibility, and decoupling and recoupling to preserve simplicity. To fully exploit the node's bandwidth, we use the remaining orphans to adjust the throughput. To make selfish mining unprofitable, we adjust the difficulty with all the blocks. The insights. We would like to draw the attention to the network layer before abandoning a well-scrutinized protocol. Designers should take a look at the actual bottleneck, experimentally confirm it, and try to eliminate it. NC max is a pipelining protocol similar to hot stuff. Compared to concurrency protocols, pipelining protocols have the same or stronger security, stronger functionality, and allow simpler design because it uses less bandwidth. And it has longer transaction confirmation latency in the best case, but shorter in the worst case. So It's actually similar. Thank you. That will be all. Any questions?
Yeah, there are some questions from the audience. The first is from the Zoom group chat. What will happen if the newly proposed transactions are indeed invalid?
So later blocks will not commit these transactions. The validity of transaction proposal zone does not affect the block validity. It is just used to synchronize transactions in the network. So okay. It doesn't affect security.
Okay. When will the next question is, when will these fresh transactions be confirmed in NCMax?
So first, the transactions are proposed. They are fresh transactions. And then there's a proposed commit distance of several blocks. After several blocks, miners will choose from their memory pool which transaction to confirm. So basically, that's the transaction life cycle in NCMax.
Okay. The next question is, intuitively, how does a block interval relate with the orphan rate?
It's an exponential. The block interval follows an exponential distribution. So you can think of the expected block interval as the input to this exponential distribution. And when two blocks are mined with interval shorter than the block propagation latency, there will be an orphan block. I think that answers your question.
Okay. The next question is, what does it mean by entropy in the block?
Entropy as in entropy in cryptography, like enough variance. For example, if all blocks are predictable, then the entropy is 0. If a block can choose 2 different values, then the entropy is 1. Namely, because each block in a consensus protocol involves the signature of the miner, the entropy is the length of the signature.
Okay. Another question is, will it be better if we adopt POS rather than POW?
I think the thing that will be better is that the block interval will be more under control. The biggest disadvantage and the remaining performance bottleneck of NCMax is that block interval still follows exponential distribution, so that there will always be some blocks who are generated very close to each other, which causes an orphan block. But with proof of stake protocol, we can fix the block interval to be 1 second or 2 seconds. We can use the protocol to prescribe that a block must be generated with more than 2 second interval, so that there will never be an orphan block. But as I said before, a proof of stake protocol has its own consequences. There must be external mechanism or extra security assumptions to ensure its security. So in general, there's a trade-off.
Okay. The last question is from Bilibili. I guess it's from one of your fans. The question is, does the presentation come from the paper published on SNP 19? Can you introduce the main methods used in the paper?
Sorry? Main method used in
the paper.
In which paper?
I guess it refers to the paper on SNP 19.
Okay, it's a Markov decision process.
Yeah.
Of course. What else? It's the state of the art.
Okay. Okay. Thanks to Ren for the great talk. I think it's very interesting. And maybe this talk can end now. Thank you again.